Russia and Ukraine have been called the world breadbasket. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine has jeopardized food supplies across the Middle East and North Africa, MENA as a region, where many countries rely heavily on imports, especially staples such as wheat. Food insecurity was already a major challenge in the region as a result of climate change, water stress, and the COVID 19 pandemic. The debt problem is also a heavily indebted countries. On behalf of Dr. Mohammed Al Ali, the CEO and the founder of Trends Research Advisory, we are honored to host Dr. Muna Ashurakami. She is Associate Professor at Mohammed bin Rashid School of Government. She has published widely on foreign aid, management, sustainable development, and public administration. And today, she will enlighten us with the food security Ukraine and the impact on the Middle East. The floor is yours, Doctor.
Thank you so much. It's an honor being here. Okay, food security, a very broad topic and a very sensitive one at the time being. And as you mentioned, Russia and Ukraine are the food baskets of the world, of course. So, having said that, and transcending the information that is widely known now and widely recognized because of the media portals and the news covering that, what is meant exactly by food security and why is it such a concern at the time being? So food security in a nutshell is a indicator that encompasses a few pillars which are really important in assessing to what extent food is available, accessible, affordable, and utilized by households and nations for that matter. And the stability of these pillars is a crucial element in assessing food security among households and countries in general. So if we were to discuss some of these challenges that these pillars face with respect to availability, for example, at the time being with the current events at the war and other economic issues and trends that are hindering the process of maintaining food security and the stability of food security. Availability, to be precise, is a matter of making the food products accessible and provided, and the challenges that are usually faced with respect to this pillar pertain to failure of harvesting food items or agri-foods in particular, sometimes economic disruptions that affect the importation of foodstuffs and food products and inputs, and the closures of markets in some cases, as we will be shedding light about such issue in a few moments, and blockades in general. With respect to the second pillar of food security, which is accessibility, some of the main challenges that hit accessibility really hard, availability of purchasing power and currency, the inflation spikes that some countries are facing now, especially import-savvy and import-dependent countries, and the devaluation of their currencies that they are facing, and of course the rising prices of food items around the world, and of course the blockades that we are facing with respect to the different routes and pathways by which products are being transported from one country to another across borders. The third pillar of food security, which is utilization. Now, this is a rather comprehensive pillar, which looks at how households utilize and maximize the benefits out of nutritious products. So the availability and accessibility of food is one element, yet the utilization and getting the required nutrition of food is a completely different dimension. Mm-hmm. An interesting piece of information I came across while I was doing some of my research, food-dependent countries or food aid-dependent countries receiving lump sums of food products, they discovered that the availability and the provision of food was addressed, yet malnutrition indicators spiked. And they discovered that the over-reliance of unhealthy, not very nutritious food items did not create the balance required by providing the food and at the same time creating the nutrition required. So the utilization of good quality food, soil that we on which we grow our food products, the preparation of food items, and the water and sanitation facilities that create the ecosystem and the environment around agri-foods, and of course culture plays an interesting role in the utilization element of food. Now, last but not least, in the food security index or pillars is the stabilization or the stability of having all the three previous elements mentioned stable, provided, and well maintained. So, having said that, we come across something which is really important that we need to know before we address and delve into food security. How do international organizations and concerned entities assess and measure food security? Okay, so having revolved around the four pillars that we just mentioned, there are multiple assessment tools adopted by some international concerned organizations, such as the FAO, for example, on top of my head, IFPRI, and many other concerned institutions who adopt scientific methodologies and measurement assessment scales in collecting information to assess to what extent are countries and households food secure or food insecure. And this brings me to a very important keyword that I always like to emphasize, which is the availability of data and the accuracy of data, by which these institutions and these organizations really need to come up with accurate food security indices. So this is a realm by itself that needs further exploration. How is data collected? What sort of data is considered accurate? What sort of data is considered up to date? And how is this data channeled and calculated using the correct econometric models to come up with these indices? Having said that, once these institutions collect the required information and the data and they come up with the food security scale or rank for each country, we have what is called the IPC, or the Integrated Phase Classification, which classifies nations according to a criteria of how grave a situation is with respect to availability of food security or no food security. So for the sake of simplicity, the IPC, or the classification of countries, could be anywhere between a scale from 1 to 5. 1 being minimal food security issues, where there could be some concerns, some, for example, trade blockages, unavailability of certain crops for whatever reason, but nothing that can spur the worry or the concern of policymakers and governments. Now we move to the second phase, which describes the food security issue as rather stressed. Phase 3 describes it as a crisis. Phase 4 describes it as an emergency, and phase 5 describes it as catastrophe. Now, I like to talk numbers. So sometimes when we really want to describe how grave the situation is and to what extent action needs to be taken, we need to look at how these numbers give a detailed description of the current situation. So a recent update of some statistics that I collected say the following. 345 million people at the time being are classified as food insecure around the world. And this figure was collected as early as the 2nd of November this month. Okay, so less than a week ago. 50 million people are classified as facing an emergency situation, so phase 4. And we have 882,000 individuals are classified as exposed to phase 5, which is famine or catastrophe phase. And to address these critical phases of food insecurity issues, the UNICTAD has actually forecasted a lump sum of almost 22.2 billion US dollars are needed to channel and to finance the gap which is currently striking countries and staring at them straight in the eye for or as a need to fill in the agri-food or the food gap which is prevalent at the time being. Okay, so skipping the details of how measurement tools are done and the terminologies associated with that, it's enough to take away with us that food security is classified or categorized according to a scale of 5 from the most, and also measure how frequent families have food provided on the table, and their consumption scores, and the frequency of purchase, and the frequency of available food items that they seek to purchase. Having said that, some countries adopt certain measures as response measures to address food security issues. And these response tactics are sometimes classified as either conditional tactics or unconditional tactics. And from the terminology used here, I think we can kind of predict or improvise or guess what exactly is meant by a conditional response to food security and an unconditional response to food security. So let's take the easier one, which is rather self-explanatory. The unconditional response to food security is an approach to address food security which does not discriminate between country's position, political ties, geographic location, nothing. There are no conditions imposed on to what extent am I supposed to or am I required to help or assist a country which is food insecure. So the unconditional response could range anywhere from providing food assistance, providing cash and voucher facilitations, providing supplementary feeding items. So these unconditional responses do not recognize any differences between countries and their counterparts. On the other hand, the conditional approach to a food security response can sometimes put some sort of requirements or prerequisites prior to any response given to a food-stricken country. So conditions, for example, pertain to the recipient country providing, for example, governance elements, and to secure governance elements are available to receive food assistance. And what do I mean by that? I mean clarity, transparency, and provision of data with respect to who's going to be receiving the food assistance and how will this food assistance be channeled and received, and well received, as a matter of fact, by recipients. So moving one step further, food security response options, whether they are conditional or unconditional, they have some sort of options. They come in different forms. So we can either look at capacity building options, for example, in the recipient country, where training and awareness and building some KSAs or knowledge, skills, and abilities by the recipient stakeholders is crucial. May take time, may consume time, but it will have a much longer term and sustainable impact with respect to recipient countries. And the other extreme will be the unconditional response, which I mentioned earlier, which basically comes in the form of humanitarian aid sometimes. And this does not require any prerequisites or any conditions for that matter. Okay, now, having explained rather briefly and as simply as possible what are the dimensions that revolve around food security, the different terminologies used when it comes to response options, the question that kind of imposes itself on the situation: what is causing the intensity of food security concerns at the time being? And the first thing that comes into our minds is the current Russian-Ukrainian conflict and the trade blockages that came along, and the fact that trade facilitation is not being exercised to the maximum potential we would like. And this can explain a lot, yet the intricate details that come along from such situation are what we need to look at. So many food-stricken countries or food insecure countries have their own share of domestic issues of violence and political unrest and conflict, which we will not delve into, but they have definitely aggravated the situation and made things a little bit worse. So countries of the sort could be, if I'm going to give examples, those who have their own domestic conflict and violence inside, countries like Somalia, like Yemen, of course, like the Syrian Republic, like Sudan, South Sudan, Nigeria, just to name a few, okay? So taking the scenario a bit more sophisticated and getting out of the domestic domain of countries which have their own share of domestic violence and concerns, we are looking at natural haphazards and hazards, as a matter of fact, that are also of big concern to some countries. things that pertain to the change in climate, okay? How climate change is being very much a concern and affecting how agri-food products are being taken care of and produced and transported and actually made available. So everything from rising temperatures to floods to droughts and anything in between is actually a threat to the food security issues that countries are taking into consideration. And let me give you one particular example which I came across also, a phenomenon known as the La Nina, which refers to the periodic cooling of ocean surface temperatures. It's an interesting terminology or term, yeah. And it's very much common in the central and east equatorial Pacific regions. And this basically happens once every 3 to 5 years, and it distorts the pattern of agri-food production and also sea and marine life. Okay. So we mentioned domestic and internal conflict, political unrest, climate change elements that are changing and creating all these dynamics in natural habitats. And last but not least, one of the favorite issues that I really like to delve into are the economic risks involved. So going back to the current situation of the Ukrainian conflict with Russia, the macroeconomic stage was badly affected. And economists are finding it very much a struggle to start from is it inflation spikes that we need to deal with and the soaring prices of energy or the soaring prices of food items that are rising because they are being unavailable at the time being? Is it the disruptors that we're facing in supply chains and value chain management issues? Is it the way central banks now are using and managing their monetary policies and their monetary measures, all the way from contractionary measures to sometimes fiscal facilitations? So it's kind of confusing. The macroeconomic arena and the macroeconomic stage is kind of confusing. But if we were to summarize some of the macroeconomic concerns that are creating economic risks to countries. So we have, for example, in 2022, and the pandemic that we faced and the lump sum of issues that we had to deal with back then in 2022 that revolved around closures and lockdowns and of course the disruptions that we faced in supply chains. So this affected the availability of food and it put lots of countries and households in the food insecure map. And of course, the war in Ukraine that had its spillover effects when it comes to trade blockages and trade export restrictions that were actually imposed by some countries, which they decided to pay more attention to their domestic needs and their domestic demand of food items and strategic food items. And of course, the most common example that I can refer to is India, okay, which gave some exceptions to some countries, and UAE was one of the exception countries which did not have any export restrictions imposed on it. So this is an example of how grave the situation could be in some countries where they would rather halt export transactions and sacrifice the positive inflows of foreign reserves coming from exports for the sake of meeting domestic demand. Other supply chain disruptions happened, whether due to COVID-19 outbreaks or the current situation in China, for example, and the zero COVID approach that it's adopting, creating even more exacerbation to the situation and to the lack of availability of food items and trade facilitation. Other macroeconomic issues that are of dire concern to some low-income countries, and I'm shedding light on low-income countries because they happen to be also import dependent and heavily import reliant on food products. So on top of my head is the example of Egypt, one of the biggest importers of wheat and other cereal crops, which is also going through a very dynamic situation now of changing its macroeconomic outlook. the way it is administering its monetary policy, the way it's administering its fiscal policy, all with the sake of, or with the objective of, trying to mitigate the impact of the war and the food insecure issues that it's facing. So putting Egypt aside as an example, but all the countries that have similar environments and similar scenarios, these economies of low income brackets are struggling with contractionary measures when it comes to their monetary policies, basically raising interest rates, raising interest rates to control inflation. However, this is having its toll on investment strategies. And why am I shedding light on this? Because investment here will not only pertain to investments in infrastructure or real estate or the stock market. We're talking about investments also in sustainable projects, whether investments in agriculture production, in agriculture infrastructure requirements, and the development strategies needed to enhance agri-food production in these countries. So investments are at stake, and they're being very sensitive to interest rates, of course. We have also countries with current account trade deficits. And again, Egypt is another good example in this case because of the over-reliance on imports. So the deficits spiking on their trade accounts and their current accounts are putting pressure on their available foreign reserves. And this is putting pressure on their domestic currencies and the need for these countries to devalue or allow for the depreciation of their domestic currencies with the hope of facilitating domestic exports, hoping that this will create foreign reserves and hence the ability to import food items that we need. So the cycle is kind of intricate and detailed, but it all revolves around what do countries need to do, or what policymakers need to take as action or actions to mitigate the impact of the war and all the spillover effects that came from it. Egypt, for example, adopted a free float approach to its currency to allow for its market value and for forces of demand and supply to determine the accurate value of the Egyptian pound, hoping to allow for better facilitated trade and better market value and market assessment to the local currency. Okay. In a nutshell, also some countries, and also Egypt, one of them, sought the support from international organizations such as the IMF and other bilateral donors in the form of investment agreements and injections of financial inflows to mitigate also or to curb the impact which is being faced now on their trade account deficits and their balance of payments as well. An interesting piece of information also from the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, was an indicator that it's keeping an eye on, which is the food price index. Now, the last recorded one was in August 2022, and it showed a 6.2% increase in the average basket of food prices compared to the same month last year. So despite some sort of control over the food price index in the past 2-3 months, yet something that we need to worry about. Domestic food inflation, of course, have as rates some 59 economies on year food inflation, 15%. So these are some figures that we need to shed some light on. Having said all these critical concerns and the problems and the drivers for food security issues, what is there for policymakers to tackle? What are the possible solutions? What are some of the policy recommendations? So we have a huge list of policy recommendations that countries are exploring, all the way from investing into R&D, research and development, exploring ways for domestic production to compensate for the import gaps that some countries are facing, trying to cut down on the over-reliance on importing food items from abroad, looking at innovative ways and smart technologies in agriculture, how to maintain sustainable agriculture food production patterns, how to depend on technology for food production, how to properly analyze different policy options to administer the situation in a wise manner, how to move from fragile food systems to more protected and more solidified food systems, and to disseminate all the agricultural food inputs required in a much more coherent, transparent, and effective manner. How to come up with soil fertility solutions for more resilient agri-food systems, and to strengthen the national agricultural research and innovation systems in general. So some of the solutions can require lots of capital to be raised. As I said earlier in my talk, that we have a funding gap of almost 22.2 billion US dollars needed to create the financial inflows for narrowing the gap between food secure and food insecure countries. But I think some innovative ways of thinking out of the box when it comes to policy making is highly required by policymakers. So we have a lot of homework to do. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Actually, it's interesting that food security is not like top leaders, something that they need to work on. It starts also from the farmers. Yeah,
yes,
definitely.
Yes.
It is quite interesting and a fruitful talk. Yet now we are moving to the questions. I have a question actually.
Please.
You have mentioned that the political unrest, the climate change, and the economic risk are kind of
Imposed on food requirements. Over and above this list, we have these current drivers of economic risks and political unrest.
So a government leader will have to work on two pillars: providing food
Yes.
and handle the population
Yes,
itself.
absolutely.
It is quite
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
I'll see and then our guest perhaps if they have any questions sent by. How can we, this is a question from Dr. Mohammed. He's asking how can we involve the private sector in the food insecurity?
Okay, amazing question. And when I briefly mentioned the element of governance, that's where all the other stakeholders come into play. So it's not a state-driven solution. It's not a state-driven strategy anymore. It's no longer that way, as a matter of fact. Governments now are trying to crowd in other stakeholders instead of crowding them out. So we do need the private sector as much as we do need NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and the civil society to come up with their own contributions to solving the problem. Private sector entities definitely have a stake in this, whether in terms of being investors, being also partners, and sharing the fruits of the benefits that will be reaped from such collaborations. So the private sector is a crucial stakeholder, very important in addressing food security concerns. And there's so many partnerships that I can think of and examples that I can think of when it comes to embarking on these journeys with the private sector, whether in terms of agriculture innovation, investments in irrigation techniques and technology, blockchain, for example. The private sector is definitely there and with a very, very strong footprint, if I may say.
Well, I think these are the questions that I have received. Thank you very much, Dr. Mana. It was a quite fruitful talk, and we have learned plenty from you.
Thank you.
Thank you very
so much. It was an honor. Thank you so much.